Hey everybody, it's Mike Donohue. We're going to talk a little COVID and the Constitution today. Thanks, Neil. All right. We're living through unprecedented times in America here in New Jersey. I think everybody understands that. I think everybody gets that to a certain extent. But we really need to focus at the moment, I believe, on our constitutional rights. Now, before anybody accuses me of trying to convince people to stop social distancing and to flood the streets or do anything else, take a look at our YouTube page. Go subscribe and check it all out, The Mike Donohue Show on YouTube, and take a look at our video about social obedience, okay? We're still there, I believe, but I think we have to focus more on our constitutional rights and give it a lot more thought than we're giving it. I think our elected officials need to do that. I think all of us need to do that because we need to remember where we started and where we need to get back to. And that's really the point. When this is all over, we have to make sure that we still have all of our constitutional rights. I'm going to discuss the First Amendment. Now, the First Amendment, pretty clear. I'll make it clearer, but Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition government for a redress of grievances. Now, how is it that we got to this point where those things have been taken away, right? We look at this and we break it down. We have a group of rights that come out of the First Amendment. Everybody thinks First Amendment, freedom of speech. Yeah, it is. Freedom of press. All right, you got that far. There's a lot more in there. Our basic human rights as Americans are memorialized in the First Amendment to a very great extent. Now, it says Congress, right? Well, through the 14th Amendment, you could take a history lesson. All of these rights are made applicable to every single United States citizen and cannot be abridged by any state government. And most state constitutions, including our own in New Jersey, contain similar provisions. So these are our God-given human rights, our constitutional rights, that cannot be taken away. Congress is not allowed to make laws that take these rights away. And when they do make a law that impacts these rights, the courts will usually step in and say, you've gone too far, or this is within the limits, like the old, you can't shout fire in a crowded theater, right? So where are we today in dealing with, let's say, our freedom of assembly, which I think is the most important thing to talk about? Our freedom of assembly has been taken away. We have no freedom of assembly. How did this happen? I don't remember our legislature voting to take our freedom of assembly away. I don't remember the state passing a law to take our freedom of assembly away. I don't remember our courts looking at that law and interpreting it and saying, okay, you can take people's freedom of assembly away. We're in a state of emergency. We're in an unprecedented state of emergency. Our state of emergency laws were designed for very temporary things like a hurricane, for example, which we're all used to down here in extreme southern New Jersey. It lasts a couple days, maybe it lasts a week, and it's over, and it's lifted. And typically your freedom of assembly is not taken away for very long, if at all. Your freedom of travel might be a little restricted, and some other things might be put in place to help clean up after the storm. But now we're in a situation where our constitutional rights have been suspended. Our legislature has been suspended. Our courts are still working and functioning, and I'm not saying legislators aren't working, and I want to talk about for a minute how my senator and his team, Mike Testa from District 1 here in New Jersey, were like voices shouting in the wilderness when it came to the governor closing our gun shops. Senator Testa, now it's not that other legislators may not have said anything, I just didn't see it. The only person I saw stepping out to support Second Amendment rights was Mike Testa in District 1, Senator Testa. Similarly, the only story I've seen so far about any of our state elected officials, now I'm sure they're out there, but the only one I've seen is from Mike Testa saying our constitutional rights are being infringed and we have to be very careful about this. I'm sure others have said it, and I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus. But the fact of the matter is, I would expect to be hearing it all the time. Don't worry, folks. This is going to be over. We're watching out for your constitutional rights, and we're going to make sure that they're not further eroded. And we're going to talk about it during the pendency of this state of emergency, that you still have these constitutional rights, that this is a temporary measure for the general good that has to be done. I'm not disputing that. I've read everything I can read, and absent massive testing and vaccination, the only way to slow this thing down is to stay away from each other. That's it. Now, could the government have treated us more like adults and less like children? Probably. And we'll fight that out and talk about it after this is all over, I hope. But for now, it's a blanket, one size fits all, everybody stay away from each other. Because that's the path of least resistance. That's the easiest thing to do. To try to start crafting things maybe where the oldest and the most infirm people are effectively quarantined and we take care of them and make sure they don't get sick. Everybody else wears a mask. These things have all been talked about. Maybe we'll get there the longer this thing goes on. But for now, the only way to slow this thing down is to stay away from each other. So I'm not advocating that we ignore this. I'm simply pointing out that we need to understand and we need to talk about our constitutional rights. Freedom of speech, whenever you close the public square, freedom of speech is limited. Now, thank God we have social media and podcasts and other things. But our freedom of speech is supposed to be broad, and it's supposed to be able to take place in the public square. What comes with that is another part of the First Amendment, which is to be able to petition and redress the government for grievances, right? I think our local elected officials especially have been going to incredible lengths to stick to the physical distancing that has to take place, but finding ways to open meetings to the public. It requires technology. Not everybody has it, but most people do. So you can go online now and you can watch your local elected officials at a meeting. You can even participate. You can ask questions. It's great. I think it's fantastic. It's still not the open public square, right? It's hard. Our right to redress the government for our grievances is very limited at the moment. Not completely suspended, like our freedom of assembly is essentially, but very limited. Now, the freedom of assembly that's been essentially taken away has directly impacted our right to practice our religion, right? You can't go to church. You can't get communion if you're Catholic or another Christian faith that engages in communion. Most do in some form. You can't do it because your freedom of assembly has been suspended. So another aspect of the First Amendment has essentially been taken away from us because of this state of emergency. No law was passed or debated. No court has reviewed any of this. And yet here we are. Now, freedom of the press, again, I think has been somewhat limited. But it's interesting to me and it's heartening, honestly, although I disagree with most of them and how they handle their journalistic ethics, which many of them seem to have forgotten. But they're there, right? Even in the White House. They're in the room. They're still getting access. They're still allowed to report and cover. And I think that's happening, pretty much all over. Much reporting these days is simply done by telephone or online or looking at press releases. There's not a whole lot of field reporting that goes on anymore anyway, sadly. Most public meetings aren't even covered anymore, which also is very disappointing. So to the extent that journalism, the way it's practiced in 2020, persists, that's probably the right that's been least eroded by this whole revocation or temporary suspension of our freedom of assembly. But it has been to some extent because people don't have access to each other. Now, I get it. I said all along throughout this podcast and before, and go to our YouTube channel, watch the Social Obedience podcast. But our constitutional rights, folks, were taken away from us overnight almost, without any debate, without any discussion, without the legislature meeting, without the courts having a chance to review it, under laws that are difficult to find, frankly, if you go look for them. You have to look in an appendix to the New Jersey statutes to find the authority of the governor, and then you have to go look at a whole bunch of regulations that are even harder to find the governor's power to do all these things. So I'm asking everyone to just do this. Understand your rights, understand they've been suspended, and pay attention. Because I'm a student of history, and I know every circumstance, almost every circumstance, except for maybe George Washington after his second term, when he could have stayed president forever, for as long as he could live in all likelihood, he walked away from power and set this tremendous example for all of us, all of our elected officials, anyone in a position of power, that you have to be able to turn it down. That's not what history shows us. What history shows us is when you put one person in charge, one man in charge of everything, inevitably that person will overreach. I'm not accusing Governor Murphy of doing that. And Governor Murphy, I think, is handling this within his abilities to the best of his ability. And hopefully all the things that he's done will help to slow this down and flatten the curve, and our medical facilities won't be overwhelmed. But I implore him to take to heart what I'm saying as well. Remember the Constitution. Remember, we don't have kings. We don't have dictators. We have the Constitution. And that controls, that is it. That contains the rights that we, the people, gave to our government, not the other way around. Government didn't give us freedom of assembly. The government didn't give us freedom of speech. We gave the government limited authority in order to do certain things. So, folks, the purpose of all this is to please ask everybody to focus on our constitutional rights. Be vigilant. Make sure you pay attention. Call your elected officials. I know they're busy, but email them, text them, call them if you feel as though your constitutional rights have been eroded beyond what is effective for a state of emergency. And I'm imploring all of our elected officials as well to stay on top of this. And when the moment arrives, when this is over, take it away. Don't leave this in place or leave that in place, or maybe this restriction makes sense in the long term, even though COVID is gone. Don't let that happen. That is our greatest fear. So please, this is Mike Donohue. Keep in mind these constitutional issues as we move forward. And I wish you all well. I'm praying for your family, and I hope you'll pray for mine. Take care, everybody.